Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Deborah Garlick from Henpicked Menopause in the Workplace, and author of the book Menopause, the Change for the Better. And the theme of today's Lunch and Learn is cognition and mood. And actually that's the theme of this year's World Menopause Day, which I'm delighted about. And I'm also delighted to be joined again by Dr. Clare Spencer from the fabulous My Menopause Centre, who's going to help us explore this topic more. So Clare, if you're like me, I'm delighted that this year's theme's cognition and mood, because we're starting to appreciate that menopause is so much more than just hot flushes.
Yes, that's absolutely right. Thank you, Deborah. Lovely to be here again. No, that's so true. So if we think about the breadth of symptoms of the menopause, really falling into categories of, think of it as sort of physical and vasomotor symptoms. So the hot flushes, the night sweats, joint aches and pains, headaches, etc. I could go on. There's the psychological symptoms, which we're going to talk about a bit more today. And under that sort of heading, I'd include symptoms related to changes in cognition, and then symptoms related to sex. And yes, it's great that they've chosen the sort of more psychological and cognitive symptoms to home in on, because they are so incredibly common and as debilitating. Some women will say to me that actually they can cope with the hot flushes. It's those changes which really feel like you're changing the essence of you, isn't it? So the changes to mood and how your brain functions, which then obviously affects how you can just go about your job, your family life, your juggling, really having a big impact.
And your job, that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because that's what we hear from people every single day when we're doing training in the workplace. As you say, they can handle the hot flushes, but actually it's the psychological symptoms that often affect them the most. And I think, the things around anxiety, mood changes, difficulty focusing and concentration, and you can really understand how that can affect someone at work. But the interesting thing is when these symptoms can start to happen. What's going on in our bodies that actually triggers these symptoms?
Yeah, so it's really, well, it's mainly to do with estrogen, in terms of the drop in estrogen and fluctuations of estrogen, and testosterone may play a part as well. So if we think about the beginning of the menopause transition, where our ovarian estrogen production can start to go a bit haywire, instead of having a nice rhythmical monthly flow up and down, the rhythm is sometimes just shocked a bit. So your estrogen can be high and it can be low, and the troughs can be deeper than they were before the start of the menopause transition, so the start of the perimenopause. And there are two important factors here. You can get symptoms that are triggered by the big fluctuation itself, from the change from high to low to high. So that's known to trigger anxiety particularly, as well as for some women, migraine. And then those deeper troughs and the overall drop in estrogen can really affect mood. So really dampen mood, lower mood, and also affect how your brain functions. So that cognitive function that many women suffer from.
And when you say about mood fluctuations and things, this is quite a tricky one for many of us, because how do you know, particularly if you're in this mysterious phase, the perimenopause, when you don't necessarily have notification that your hormones are changing, how do you know that these symptoms are as a result of menopause or just something else?
Yeah, and in reality, it can be really difficult. And it's why often blood tests can be useful to rule out other physical conditions, like, for example, changes in thyroid function. So how do you know? So I think if we just home in on mood changes first, and that lowered mood and maybe heightened anxiety, there are a few clues. So some women's brains are just more susceptible to hormonal fluctuations and drops. And so there may be a history, you may have had premenstrual syndrome through your reproductive life. You may sort of have had a shocker at puberty, you know, sort of felt really grim as your ovaries burst into life and started making estrogen. Or you might have had postnatal depression. Some women have really struggled on hormonal contraception, and they're sort of, it's not 100% fail-safe, but they're indications that actually, as your hormones start to change in the perimenopause, what you're experiencing is a result of changing hormones. And of course, if you've got a history of depression or anxiety, if you've suffered in the past, we know that the menopause transition can re-trigger that, or it can worsen pre-existing dementia, pre-existing depression and anxiety also. It's really hard. There's a big overlap of symptoms. It is difficult.
So it's worth understanding how your body was affected by hormonal changes before.
Yes, but I think it's also really important to say that you may have swum through life merrily without any anxiety, without any mood issues, and then with those profound changes for no good reason, you just notice changes creeping in. Like, for example, I think it's such a common symptom. Women will say to me that they don't want to drive on the motorway anymore. You know, that confrontation with your own mortality just seems to trigger any sort of underlying anxiety, or sweating the small things, or just not finding enjoyment, not looking forward to holidays or events that you usually would be looking forward to. You know, it doesn't have to be a swamp of symptoms. It's small, subtle changes that you just notice that don't make you feel quite like yourself.
It's unusual that you say about getting in the car, going in the motorway, because I'd say that's probably one of mine. I'm a nervous passenger. I never was before. And it's one of those where I just feel out of control. So the slightest thing in the road, I start to catastrophize in my head. My husband's actually a very good driver, but I'm not a good passenger anymore. So it's knowing those things, to watch out for them, is actually empowering, isn't it? Because it's like, well, could this be something that is telling me my hormones are changing?
No, completely. And once you know there's a reason, once you understand what's going on behind the scenes, once I explain it to women, often you can just see the relief in their faces that there is a reason. It's not like suddenly you can't cope, you can't juggle. You know, it's knowing that, because then also it allows you to consider your options, to know what to do about it for the positive.
One of the things that we've discussed before is actually some of these symptoms are the ones that can really chip away at your confidence. You don't feel like you anymore.
I think that's absolutely right. And going back to what you were saying about work at the beginning, I hear that such a lot. Right? It doesn't matter if you're working in the home, working in a workplace, it does chip away at your self-esteem, your self-confidence. You start to not feel like yourself. You start to doubt your abilities because of that negative thinking that's creeping in. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I think the fact that this webinar, this Lunch and Learn, booked so fast as soon as we put out the topic, says just how many people are affected by this. But when it comes down to being affected, and we're all individual, we're all unique in this, and so will be our preference on how we manage those symptoms. So what are the options? What can people do if they are experiencing these symptoms?
Okay, so again, if we're just focusing on low mood and depression, the first thing I would say, it's not uncommon for women to feel down, depressed, hopeless, and even to feel that they don't want to be here. It's uncommon to feel suicidal with the menopause, but it is, you know, some women do. And I think the first thing is, if you are feeling desperate, if you are feeling in any way like that, if you're having dark thoughts, please speak to somebody, your GP, call 111, have a look at the Samaritans. There's a helpline on the Samaritans website with a free phone number. or take yourself to A&E. You know, please do something if you are having those thoughts. Don't just keep them hidden away and worrying by yourself. If you are at the milder end of the spectrum, which is going to be the majority of women having some form of depressive symptoms, then there is lots that you can do to self-help. So looking at lifestyle, there's really good evidence that increasing exercise, which we know can be just small, it doesn't have to be running a marathon, just increase what you're doing, get outside. If it's not activity, then, you know, looking at other forms of activity like yoga, where you're actively switching your brain off, you're making yourself relax, can be helpful. Looking at diet, I know that you're just about to have another lunch and learn on diet and mood, which is absolutely brilliant. So I'm not going to say too much about that, but having big peaks and troughs of blood sugar probably doesn't help already low mood. There are feel-good foods keeping your blood sugar stable. There's evidence that that can help. So diet, exercise, talking therapies, you know, even if it's chatting to your friends and sharing your feelings, sharing the load, through to sort of looking at cognitive behavioral therapy and counselling, which you can self-refer to, available on the NHS. That there is a wait. The NICE guideline advise that it's up to 80. You should be seen within 18 weeks. But obviously there are areas that are better and worse than that. Talking therapies. If your symptoms are related to the menopause and the menopause transition, actually there's evidence that hormone replacement therapy, so replacing the estrogen, is really effective at helping you feel better. And I do see the transformative effects of HRT. You know, HRT is not for everybody, it's an individualized choice, but it can be really helpful. And or antidepressants. You know, if you are at the more severe end of the spectrum, if you've been diagnosed as having clinical depression, it may be that you do need antidepressants. And sometimes I do see women who are really struggling. You can get part of the way with HRT, but then maybe you need a low dose antidepressant just to take you that, you know, just to where you need to be. So I would say it's a combination of all of the above that can be really helpful.
It is, and actually the first step is understanding what's going on for you, isn't it? So, you know, I'm really glad that you said that around if you get into that place that you're absolutely desperate, you seek help straight away. But it's also worth us understanding what's going on for us, reading up from expert resources, My Menopause Centre, the Henpicked Menopause Hub, where there are experts talking about, there's no advertisements or anything else like that, but this expert advice and information that enables you to make informed choice around this time. Because I can see the chat is going bonkers with comments coming through, and quite clearly I've seen a couple of them as they've sort of dropped in the chat box that say, I'm glad this is not just me. And I think that's something we hear a lot, isn't it?
Yes, because if you think about the symptoms of depression, you know, as well as those horrible feelings, it's the activities that then it's the sort of changes in activity that then are affected. So, you know, withdrawal, not wanting to go out, not wanting to speak to people, you know, that can then you just get knocked in this vicious cycle. You know, we talked about loss of confidence, again, impacting on your not wanting to reach out to other people. So yes, absolutely.
One thing that just came into my mind when you were saying all of that is because one thing, when you say about antidepressants, we often hear from women that say, but I'm not depressed, I'm menopausal, why am I being prescribed antidepressants? And particularly if they've been to the GP and the GP said, oh, well, I won't give you HRT, try these antidepressants. Where are we with that?
I think, so the important point here is GP education, which I'm completely passionate about. So it's just educating GPs actually, you know, this is a symptom, it's a common symptom of the perimenopause, and HRT is likely to be more effective than an antidepressant. And so I do think the tide is turning. I think it's brilliant. For example, we're all talking today, and so women are increasingly asking for HRT rather than antidepressants. So I do think that that's changing, but I'm not going to move away. You know, that really was the case. You know, it would be very common that somebody would be given an antidepressant rather than HRT for these symptoms.
But as you say, for some people, it might be HRT and then antidepressants on top.
You might, not commonly, but just occasionally. The HRT doesn't take you all the way back to where you need to. You know, if there's been a sort of overlap between depressive symptoms and clinical depression, yeah.
Okay, and I know when we've talked before, understanding where you are right now and how these treatments are working for you is important, because it's likely that you won't get exactly what you need first time.
No, absolutely. And tweaking HRT, which was spoken about before, is, it's sort of unusual to get it right the first time, and it's not being despondent if you start a form of HRT and you're not feeling quite right. It may be that the HRT just isn't the best HRT for you. And I do think it's worth calling out that we know that HRT is 2 hormones. If you haven't had a hysterectomy, you need estrogen, which obviously makes you feel better, but you also need another hormone called a progestogen. And that's because estrogen can thicken the womb lining, and that can increase your risk of cancer of the womb lining. So you need this other hormone called progestogen to keep the womb lining thin. But there's a small percentage of women who really do not tolerate progestogens. When you swallow progestogens, some of the breakdown products can affect the brain and lower your mood. And that can be really tricky. It can take a few attempts to find a route and a type of progestogen that you tolerate. So I do think it's worth calling that out, that it is a conversation. It is looking at the different options and how it suits you as an individual.
Agree. And I think the don't give up when you don't necessarily find the first one, because we sometimes hear people saying, I tried HRT once and it didn't work for me. And we say, well, which one? Which one did you try? There's different brands, there's different delivery methods, there's different strengths in all of this. So don't give up in all of that. And one that's come up in chat is, why is testosterone not offered more? Does that have a role to play in this too?
Yes, no, it can. So testosterone probably does have an impact. Well, we know that testosterone is important in keeping normal brain function is probably the best way to think about it. It's important. It contributes to mood. It contributes to your brain firing in the way that it needs to be fired. It probably contributes to repair of the brain if it's injured. The issue with testosterone is it's not licensed for women in this country, and it's not easy for GPs to prescribe it. GPs aren't allowed to initiate testosterone in the majority of areas. There are small pockets of small areas around the country where they are increasingly being able to initiate it. The evidence, though, for testosterone helping also is tricky. So the best evidence for the benefits of testosterone is around libido and sex drive. So we know that testosterone can help libido for a percentage of women if it's totally gone out of the window in the menopause. But actually the evidence that it does help mood and cognitive function, so the brain fog, that mental sharpness, memory, word finding, is actually quite poor when you look at the research studies. And so it's not currently recommended to be initiated just for that purpose, although we all know women, I hear a lot anecdotally from women who have found it has helped their mood and their brain function. So testosterone is complicated as part of this picture, helps some, doesn't help others. And the research at the moment doesn't quite back up what we're hearing in clinic.
Thank you very much, Dr. Clare. I'm going to invite my colleague Sarah on to answer some of the questions, but one tiny one I've got is there a time limit to being able, how long you can take HRT for. This is a continual theme that we see on the questions.
Yeah, so I would always say there is no time limit. We know that in your 50s, the benefits definitely outweigh any small risks of HRT. And the risk is sort of dependent also on the type of HRT that you take. As you gain years, you may need to change the type of HRT that you're taking, and you may need to accept that really small increased risk of breast cancer year on year that exists with HRT. As I say, some types of HRT have a lower risk of breast cancer than others, but as long as you accept those and you remain healthy, etc., I would say there's no arbitrary cutoff. You carry it as long as you want to take it for.
Thank you, and I'll hand over to Sarah Bryn-Jones now, who's been looking at the questions all the way through. Sarah.
Thank you so much, Deborah, and thank you so much, Dr. Clare. I just wanted to touch on a few things, Dr. Clare, that have been raised. You know, people are saying it's a relief to hear about the symptoms, so what you've been sharing today. People are saying, I'm so glad I'm not alone. You know, so you've created this incredible support group within the chat as well. People are exchanging email addresses with each other, and yeah, really lovely support and lots of sharing. So thank you so much to all of you that have been doing that. A couple of people were asking earlier on, Dr. Clare, alternatives to HRT. You've covered a lot about HRT, but what if you can't take HRT? What are the alternatives and how can they help?
So I would say that sort of depends a little bit on what your main symptoms are, what the most bothersome symptoms are. So all the lifestyle changes that I've touched on can really significantly help all menopause symptoms across the board generally. Then if hot flushes are your main complaint, keeping you awake at night, affecting sleep, then there is medication that can be prescribed by your GP or a menopause specialist that can target hot flushes. So for example, there is a blood pressure tablet called clonidine, which for some women will take the edge off or stop hot flushes, which then has a knock-on positive effect on sleep. And if you can sleep, then everything feels better. There are other prescription medications that can help take the edge off. So, for example, gabapentin, oxybutynin, which is a bladder-related tablet. Antidepressants do have their role to play. If you are really struggling and have been advised not to take HRT, they can help lift mood, they can help keep a lid on anxiety, and they can help take the edge off hot flushes. You might have to work through 2 or 3 to get to where you need to be, but there is evidence that they can help. And finally, I'd really call out cognitive behavioral therapy, because there is a lot of good evidence that not only does it help psychological symptoms of the menopause, but also cognitive and physical symptoms, and the way it challenges your thoughts and your beliefs and the impact on then that has on behavior. If you've suffered from cancer and that's why you've been advised not to take HRT, then Maggie's charity is amazing, actually. There are Maggie's centres in many hospitals around the country, and I know that that's one place you can access CBT. There will be others, that's one that I know about. There are supplements, there's alternative therapies that, you know, some people will find help with. You just have to be a bit careful with supplements and particularly herbal remedies, that it's not going to interact with medication that you're taking, and that it's not actually got estrogen-like activity that could potentially have risks. So just eyes wide open on that one.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Yeah, there are a number of questions related to what vitamins, what supplements could I take, and Deborah hosted Deborah, didn't you, the herbs and complementary session that we ran back in July. Well worth having a look at that recording from Lunch and Learn, because that was really useful. So lots of personal questions coming in, which obviously we can't answer the personal questions. I'm trying to look at themes, Dr. Clare, that we can respond to. We touched on the time limit for HRT, but the actual end, a couple of people are asking, is there an end to my menopause symptoms? When can I finish? And I suppose if you touch on the theme of cognition and mood, any advice, anything you can give up front on that one?
Yes. So just in terms of mood, well, on average, menopause symptoms last around 8 years, but we all know women who it's just gone on and on and on. And certainly I have women in my clinic in their 70s, even 80s, utterly, completely fed up and seeking help. But that's a small percentage of women. So 8 years is the sort of average. And we do know that if your mood dips, if your anxiety heightens in that transition, it can improve, it can get better. And there is evidence to show. And I just wonder if it's something to do with how your body adapts to its sort of new normal state. And cognitive symptoms also, for some women will get better. So we haven't talked so much about, brain fog, that cotton wool feeling in your brain, word finding difficulties, memory issues, poor concentration, poor self-esteem that comes across as a result of it. And some of it is a direct effect of the loss of estrogen, and so you might adapt. Some of it is because of physical symptoms or loss of sleep. So it is quite complicated, but in a roundabout way, they can get better. For some women, they may just linger on. If your symptoms are lingering on, I think it's worth just speaking to your doctor and making sure that just ruling out other medical conditions. And then, obviously just think, do I want HRT after all? Am I fed up? What am I going to do? And how can I change my life in a way that could help my symptoms and help me deal with them better in a more positive way?
Fantastic, thank you. Sorry, Deborah, were you going to speak?
It's an interesting one, isn't it, Dr. Clare? Because I'm reading through some of these comments in the chat, and actually I think I could have written most of them myself at some point during my menopause transition, particularly the one about brain fog. And when you were saying earlier about what can we do to help ourselves, one of the things that we do know makes things worse is stress. Stress makes things worse. So if ever there was a time to say, I need a bit of me time, or I've got too much on, I need to take a pause to manage my stress levels, drop my shoulders, because actually that will help with some of the psychological symptoms. So we do really have to prioritise our well-being much more than just taking HRT or and everything else, don't we? It is that lifestyle can make such a huge difference.
Yes, I completely agree. And it's not a personal failing. I think I hear that a lot as well. Symptoms cause stress. Life is stressful at this time. Symptoms cause stress. The impact of the symptoms causes stress in the working environment. There's increased stress, there's increased pressure. And if there, as you say, ever was a time to teach yourself how to switch off, if you're somebody who's been used to juggling the whole time, running on high octane, in a high octane job the whole time, you just sort of have to teach yourself to step back, don't you, and just switch off, give your brain a break, and just reset a little bit.
As you said, Sarah, the comments in the chat and the support people are giving each other and saying it's not just you, it's me as well. In some ways I find that quite reassuring, because I used to think it was just me, and being able to talk about it, I'm sure talking about this is helping people understand you're not alone. It can happen. Don't panic about it. Cut yourself some slack and say I'm only human, and understand what you can do about it, but don't sort of berate yourself and think actually now I'm failing.
Yeah, and I love one of the chats that's just come in, Deborah, don't forget how strong you are, is and that's it, isn't it? We all beat ourselves up on a daily basis, don't we?
We do. We do indeed.
Many sharings on yoga, meditation. Lots of people are making so many suggestions in the chat as well. Someone's asked where they can get the recordings from previous sessions. I'll post that link in a moment for you as well.
And we'll look through all of the comments, because there is cognitive behavioural therapy. There are free resources available on cognitive behavioural therapy while you're waiting for your appointments. under the NHS, if you can use those. There was one other thing that came up, and we've heard this on a couple of other lunch and learns, which is the link between menopause and autism. And I can give you a little update on that one, because there is little understood around menopause and autism. And you might think, well, how are the two connected? Well, actually, what we've learned from the professors at University of Bournemouth is that many men tend to, or males tend to be diagnosed more with autism and ADHD than women. However, during the menopause transition, more and more women are being diagnosed retrospectively as experiencing autism or ADHD. It was just never picked up before, but it does influence how they experience the change. So I'm delighted to say, and this is something that we're doing through menopause-friendly menopause-friendly employer awards next week. Henpicked will be paying for a 3-year study on the link between menopause and autism and ADHD, because we've recognised it is a significant gap in research, and we want to understand how our different neurodiversity actually impact on menopause. So we'll probably get the two professors that are leading that study sharing the information that they've got in the initial part of the study very, very shortly. So yes, there is a link, and we'll be able to share more about that shortly. But that was a huge amount of content to cover in a short period of time. Are we out of time now, Sarah? Or
I'm afraid. I'm sorry. We do need to bring the session to an end. But thank you so much, Dr. Clare, and thank you so much, Deborah.
Yes, as always, thank you very much, Dr. Clare Spencer from My Menopause Centre, and hop over to their website as well. It's always got really helpful resources in there too. And thank you very much, Sarah, as you say. Thank you to everybody for all of your comments in chat and for the support you're giving each other. And the more we do all get together like this and bust those myths and learn all about menopause together, then I'm sure it's going to be better for us all. So thank you very much.